My name's Lisa Pittman, and I'm an attorney here in Austin, and I've been working in cannabis and hemp since about 2015, and including getting our hemp law passed in Texas here, and I'm on the Texas Department Industrial Hemp Advisory Council. And it's been, really fun to get to know everyone in the industry, and particularly these guys that I invited to come speak with me today about these issues. So we've got Randy Rivera from the Texas Department of Agriculture. He's the director of Agriculture Commodity Program, and he's had a long career, 35 years of doing this. In fact, he came back after retirement. Previously, he was the administrator for agriculture regulatory programs, which included pesticides and plant quality. The things that he supervises currently are hemp and organics, grain warehouse, and seed quality. He was a food tech major at Texas Tech. And then we've got Mr. Mark Krause here. He's the owner and principal scientist of Krause Analytical LLC. Located in Austin, Krause Analytical provides support services to the cannabis industry, including custom formulations, analytical support services, production troubleshooting, and legal support and expert witness work. Mr. Krause has been in the analytical laboratory business for over 45 years and has been heavily involved in the regulatory process in environmental science, food and pharmaceuticals, and now cannabis. And he, as an expert witness, at trial, he's very good at translating complicated chemistry matters into plain language. And so that's another reason why I wanted him to come talk to us about these things today. So we'll start with Randy. Can you talk to us about the different issues involved in formulating rules in Texas and how that relates to the USDA, the FCA, data collection, and tell us some stories from the field?
Okay.
I know that was a lot.
Can y'all hear me okay? First of all, good morning. It's good to be here on the campus of Texas A&M. Two things. I never imagined that my career would take me eventually to regulate hemp. And two, I never imagined that I would be at a cannabis policy discussion on the campus of Texas A&M. Yeah, here we are. So that said, Lisa, to kind of get into it a little bit. So, the Farm Bill obviously was the precursor to allow the state of Texas to institute or legislate the hemp law, which went into effect 2 legislative sessions ago. And was it 2 sessions? Yeah, it was 2 sessions ago. Yeah, 2 sessions ago. And in that process, we, at the TDA, were handed the responsibility to administer the hemp program for the state of Texas. And through that process, as an agency, worked with the attorneys and various stakeholders to promulgate regulations to regulate the law or regulate the program under the hemp law and the federal guidelines. And I think right away we found that process to be quite frustrating. I guess one, because the program came over to the Department of Agriculture and to DPS and to some degree DSHS without absolutely any funding whatsoever. So we had to basically, absorb that program, develop a licensing program at the Department of Agriculture for hemp. And we had to do that inside a period of about 6 months or less from the time the law was passed and the time we actually issued the first license. And so I'm proud to say that we did that. In fact, we did that way inside of 6 months. Luckily, because we are a licensing entity at the Department of Agriculture, we have other licensing programs. So we were able to mimic, if you will, some of the other licensing programs and absorb that and just continue right on rolling. So that was a challenge. I think the other challenge was, and I think we've talked about it a little bit inside discussions here, is the law that was written in Texas is called the Industrial Hemp Law. And the authors of that, for better or for worse, considered that this would be an agricultural law, if you will. And everything that we were working on was on the premise of growing hemp for fiber. And lo and behold, what we discovered right away is that there's this whole other industry out there that, is related to CBD and all of that business. And that really posed a lot of challenges for us. So I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but that's.
Yeah, just an overview. And, a lot of people wonder why we don't have certain rules that we might like to have. And we're kind of constrained by the USDA. So can you explain that and what the relationship is between TDA and USDA and how y'all communicate?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, the precursor to the Texas hemp law was obviously the federal rule, the 2018 Farm Bill. And that, laid the framework, what we, the legislature passed in Texas. And again, going back to what I said, it was really written almost from an agronomic principle of growing grain or something like that, and not really taking into consideration all of the hemp that would be grown, say, in a greenhouse setting or some dooryard setting. And so we had to write regulations that stayed within those boundaries of the law, yet write them broad enough to allow people to be able to grow in an indoor setting or in a dooryard or in a greenhouse or something like that. So that was challenging, and it's still challenging because we have lots of folks that are growing outside of a traditional agricultural field, if you will, that we kind of have to almost by policy get a little creative so that we don't infringe upon either the statute or federal rules with regard to the production of hemp.
Do you have a ballpark estimate on how many folks participating in the hemp program are traditional farmers versus those that got in and hemp is the first thing that they have really grown?
One of the things that we capture when somebody does an application for a license is, they check a little box as to what their intended purpose for their hemp production is. And I suppose some of that, maybe I'm going to say that probably 25 to 35% of the people growing hemp are actually growing it for some fiber agricultural use. The rest of those are growing for some other use, CBD, maybe their own use, and somewhere in between. And so it's really hard to gauge that. I know that FSA, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but one of the requirements for playing in the hemp world, if you will, is that you have to report this information to the Farm Service Agency of USDA, and they are going to start really enforcing that. Initially, we were kind of putting that on the producer to kind of self-regulate, if you will, but now our hand is going to be forced. And so in that, I think there's going to be some better reporting for those numbers of who's growing where and what and for what purpose.
Okay, and what is your personal role in the enforcement of the hemp program? So when are people going to hear from you?
So as far as the agency is concerned, our role is to develop the licensing program, allow people to become licensed, allow people to grow the hemp legally. And so when in these first couple of years in the development of the program, we have been in what's the term I'm trying to use here? Enforcement by education, if you will. As I mentioned, the program come over with, from the legislature without any funding. So we are working right now with the legislative budget board to try to get some funding so that we can do some additional enforcement, so that we can actually go out and monitor some of the things that we are requiring by regulation. For example, if somebody obtains a lot crop permit to grow X variety, we need to be able to send, inspectors into the field, even at a random basis, to determine if what they're telling us on paper is actually true in the field. So,
well, can you explain to everybody a little bit more about that relationship between the legislature not giving you the funding you needed? Because I know there are a lot of people complain about having to spend money on a sample, on a transport manifest, and that kind of starts to rack up.
Sure. And I'm gonna answer your question this way. So the statute put a cap on the license fee, I think $100. Well, we are a fee for service agency, like most other agencies. We have to build a program, and we have to build that program on the fees that we capture. There's just no way we could possibly pay for a program on $100 license fee. So by regulation, we had to institute some fees to go along with that licensing aspect. So the $100 license gets you in the door, so to speak. And then the permit fees that come along with that are fees that we have been gathering to try to recoup the cost of doing business, the cost of running a licensing program, running eventually an enforcement program, and so on. So if you tally the fees from start to finish, say if you're going to grow 1 acre or 1,000 acres, one variety, we estimate that cost of licensing is probably going to run you somewhere between $600 to $1,000 by the time you get licensed, by the time you get a lot crop permit, by the time you get transport manifest, by the time you pay for the official permit fee, by the time you pay a lab to run your test. So we're estimating somewhere around $600 to $1,000. And again, that's one variety, whether you're going one plant or whether you're going 1 million plants. That's that. And my guess is that fee probably doesn't come close to what other licensing entities around the country charge for a license.
It's true. Your plain license just to grow hemp is cost a lot more in other states. And understanding that you've got to collect fees in order to run the program, is there any chance some of this will be changing in the future?
Well, we, by regulation, wouldn't necessarily change it per se. I think the change is going to probably have to happen at the legislature. So if I can answer your question.
Okay, well, sure. Let's get into some juicy sampling issues. Talk about, there's some newer procedures, how it was, what it's going now, the retest and all
Sure.
of the things that are kind of getting better.
So, again, going back from the development of a program, one of the things that, we had to do is immediately adopt some sort of a sampling procedure. And so we used the sampling procedures that were provided to us by USDA. Because obviously we didn't have anything like that in Texas yet. So we adopted those early on so that we could kind of get the program going. Since then, the USDA came out with their final rule and amended those sampling procedures a little bit. And so we are gradually following, their lead on that. Those sampling procedures are very rudimentary, black and white. I don't even know how to describe them other than, and I'm give you an example. The minimum requirements, say, for sampling in a crop, it's let's say you're growing an acre, would be to pretty much sample one plant. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but I believe that's right. So if your sampler doesn't really have an idea, doesn't really know what they're doing, they may go sample that one plant, and they may sample that tallest, most mature plant. Well, guess what? The likelihood that plant comes back hot is probably pretty likely. And so that's been a challenge for us, not really having a comprehensive sampling plan as a state. Other states have, because they've been doing this a while, are more adept in coming up with some, better sampling procedures in that. But be that as it may, because we realize that, we've also allowed for that second sample to be taken on occasion.
Can you explain that? Where are the second samples?
Yeah, so when, and let me talk about, there's 2 second samples, all right? So the second sample, typically what we're talking about is that second sample that when the lab gets that sample from the sampler, they split that sample in 2, they run one, and if there's a problem with that, then they can run the second one. But, when we've gotten back information from the producer, or maybe even the lab or the sampler, that there was a problem with that particular sample pool, we have allowed for an additional sample to be pulled so that if there was some error in the way the sampling was pulled or handled or things like that, that they could bring that, bring us another sample to run, especially obviously when that first sample was either corrupted, that it couldn't be tested, or that it tested above the point 0.3.
Is it on the same plant or a different?
Well, the true second sample can be pulled on
Okay.
back on the crop, wherever and however that needs to be pulled.
And Mark, I know you take samples in your lab. Can you comment on the statistical significance of these different samples?
If your sampler is taking, let's make an assumption here. Let's just arguments like 2,500 plants per acre, roughly.
Yeah.
Okay, if you've got 2,500 plants per acre and your sampler is taking samples from anything less than 10 plants, he's not doing you any favors at all. You need to take a statistically representative sample of that acre. And in our mind, from a laboratory standpoint, we would define that typically as 10 to 20 plants.
And so in that also, when the final rule came out from USDA, they allowed for more of the plant sample to be taken. And I think initially it was a top 3 inches. And now I think they're allowing up to 5 inches of that plant. And so that helps a little bit. But again, if somebody's taking a sample of just one plant, to Mark's point, you may or may not pass the, the 0.3% THC threshold. So
if you don't pass, what happens?
I beg your pardon?
If you don't pass it, what happens?
So if you don't pass, then, that following both the statute and the federal rule, then that crop theoretically has to be destroyed. However, in the final USDA hemp rules, the USDA, I think, has realized that the sampling procedures, had a discussion there with Mr. Johnson a while ago, where the nexus of that 0.3% comes from. They were dealing with leaves and stems and leaves essentially when they kind of came up with that parameter or that threshold for the 0.3%. And so their USDA now is allowing for remediation. So remediation, I think, really probably helps somebody that's growing for fiber or for herd or for some agricultural, what we could consider an agricultural use. Somebody growing for CBD purposes, probably not so much. But remediation allows you to then maybe take a broader sample of the plant or plants, combine that and sample it versus sampling the top 3 to 5 inches. And obviously that would then dilute your sample so that your THC level should come back at the 0.3% if you're growing, the right variety, if you will.
Mhm.
Mark, when you mentioned taking 10 to 20 samples, then are you creating one composite sample?
When it gets to the lab, yes, that's what the labs
So
do
the
typically.
lab is creating composite.
So typically what the labs do is split the sample received in 2. One is called a retain, so that one gets put away in case something happens to this one. This one will go through a grinding process. So they'll take everything that comes in with the sample, throw it in a grinder, grind it to really fine powder, and then you'll use that powder to do the testing in the laboratory.
And how often are you doing double blind?
Well, on a sample like that, it'd be really hard to do a double blind because you know that it's supposed to be hemp, right? This is part of it. So it's not coming to you as a blind sample, but you do have quality control criteria that you're supposed to be using. You have to follow ISO procedures for the laboratory. So ISO does have some specifications as to you have to run spikes, you have to run blanks, you have to run a standard curve, you have to run duplicate samples, so many samples. If the laboratory is actually doing their job, it's about it amounts to about 10% of the total analytical load is quality assurance.
Do we have any other sampling questions? Go ahead. It's a crucial part of the process. Go ahead. All right here.
And I think to answer your question, and I don't know if everybody really heard your question, so it might be worth repeating. But you're growing, say, for industrial fiber, and your question is, would you be allowed to, say, remove the flowers from the plant and then, say, sample the rest of it to allow for you to use that crop? And the answer to that is yes. And I'm going to qualify that a little bit by saying, but, you know, before we go down that road, we'd want to deal with you on a one-on-one to make sure that we're on the same page regarding what you're doing. Sure. No, I can't disagree with you. And so, sure. And again, that's, you know, that's why I say from a fiber perspective, where you've got that much out there and obviously a lot at stake, the remediation thing is really going to help you guys. And it's something we're still working through at TDA to try to figure that part out, because that just came out, you know, with the federal rule. But we realize that that's allowed by the hemp rule now, and in statute in Texas, it's also allowed. Initially, because the hemp rule was more restrictive, than we couldn't do it in Texas, even though the statute in Texas allowed it. Now that it's allowed by the feds, we have more latitude to deal with that issue. And if you know, we'll deal with folks on a one-on-one basis to make sure that we're not violating the statute or the federal rule when it comes to the whole remediation thing. You know, we're learning. So, but we'll be glad to work with you on that. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us some stories from the field on remediation, when law enforcement gets involved and when you get involved?
Yeah. And so before we go that, I think Mr. Johnson
Oh,
had a
okay.
question. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
First of all, great, thank you for everything. Since interaction one has been awesome, working with you guys. I just have a little bit of feedback. Want to know, is there any plan to bring the samplers in and do some training with them? Because from a lab standpoint, we still get phone calls from samplers that are on the samplers list that include the USDA training.
Yeah. And then Johnson,
Imagine that.
Mr. Johnson, that's a great question. I know you and I have had a discussion about that on, you know, by phone. We haven't come up with anything, you know, definite, but I know that we've had discussions with our partners over at Texas Agri-Life Extension with Dr. Krause. He's very interested in doing something like that because he saw early on that was going to be an issue. And again, you know, due to a lack of resources, quite frankly, primarily, we really haven't moved forward with that, but something that we definitely would entertain. And, you know, if we needed to work to, you know, cooperatively with some private entity, we would not be opposed to that. It's just a matter of putting something like that together and making sure that it's transparent in nature.
Be okay if we started like emailing, hey, you know, this sample contacted us.
Yeah, knock yourself out. I mean, I wouldn't have any issues with that at all. Uh-huh.
Yes, ma'am.
When you talk about sending to the lab, I ran the same test this past year. I thought it was something that Texas A&M did. Beautiful crop. When it came to having the labs tested, my recommendation of student was send it to Oregon if you want to get the test. Does the Texas Department what is the lab you're talking about?
So, good question. We have, if I just recall from memory, roughly about 25 labs that are certified to run samples, you know, that are. Don't believe so. I don't believe so, ma'am. But I know that we have several, you know, certified around the state. And I believe that there's even a couple that are out of state certified. But I know there's plenty in Texas. Yes, ma'am, absolutely. Mhm.
And the other question was, the farmers that are raising as this man that you don't folks that work for all years, but not
Right.
attorney.
Sure.
Where is there anything open in Texas to process this?
So I'm going to answer your question two ways. I know that there's a group of farmers up on the Texas South Plains that, oh, I'm sorry, sure. Is there, do I know of any large farmers that are, or farmers that are growing large acreages of hemp? And two, are there processors in the state? Sure. So the first question, I know that there's a consortium of farmers up on the Texas South Plains that are growing, acreages of hemp for fiber, herd, various agricultural uses, industrial uses. And they have kind of developed their own market, I guess, so to speak. Lisa, you probably know a little bit more about it than I do, but they've developed their own market and kind of working as a co-op, if you will, to find markets for their product. Answer to your second question, we've got a number of people that have registered with our agency as processors. Whether they're actually processing, large volumes of hemp for fiber or other things, I couldn't tell you that. But I do know that we have a number of folks that have also worked with the likes of the associations here in Texas to try to develop, markets for that. How far they've gotten down the road, I wouldn't be able to answer that. I think there's somebody here from Extension that might be able to speak to that a little more, but I wouldn't know anything about that.
Okay, well, tell us some stories from the field.
So third, I missed one thing. So the third thing was I could have never have imagined that I would talk to as many law enforcement agencies in my career as I have in the past 2 years. And, right, wrong, or indifferent, most of the law enforcement jurisdictions, especially removed from cities, had no idea that this hemp thing was, on the horizon. So imagine you're a sheriff's deputy in some small rural jurisdiction somewhere, and you roll up on either some hemp farm or some hemp greenhouse. And as you all know, y'all saw the plants up here earlier, it looks like the other stuff. And so to them, that's what it was. And so immediately, in most cases, the grower held up their, TDA black and white license and said, hey, I'm licensed by TDA. So, the law enforcement official usually didn't believe them. No, that's marijuana. You're going to jail. We're going to take that stuff from you. No, sir, you need to call TDA. This is my license. And so I spent a lot of time on the phone, several times a week with law enforcement jurisdictions around the state, educating them on what hemp is and what hemp is not. And so that, again, going back to the challenges of absorbing a program and not having any funding to educate, to go out and really talk about all of this to, people of the state of Texas to the nth degree, the law enforcement, that made it a challenge. And so that's, I could probably get into some specific stories, but just in general, talking to a lot of different, law enforcement jurisdictions around the state and trying to educate them on, yes, that is a hemp license. Yes, sir, he is legal to grow hemp. And these are the steps that somebody has to go through in order to grow hemp. And 9 times out of 10, okay, and they walked away. In some cases, there was, some guys that maybe were just a little too eager and confiscated plants before they even, verified the information, and probably they got into some hot water along the way somewhere. But in most cases, it was a good learning tool for all of us.
Does anybody want to hear one of his specific stories? I do.
A specific story. I don't know that I can say any of those just because there may be some impending legal issues. Wow. I'll give you one. And this one down in Southeast Texas, I got a call from one of our inspectors one afternoon, and he was in a frenzy, in a panic. He said, man, you've got to call this guy with DEA, DPS, somebody, they've drawn guns on this guy and they've got people on the ground with, guns pointed at them because they think they're, growing marijuana. And, it must have been some large acreage or some greenhouse. And so I immediately, got on the phone with them and, after several minutes of phone calls and maybe 2 or 3 phone calls, was able to convince the person at the other end of the phone call that yes, they're legal, they're growing hemp, this is their license, I can verify it for you. I'm so-and-so with the Department of Agriculture. This is a hemp law, this is a federal hemp. So it was, yeah, we did a lot of that. So that's been interesting. Typically they don't come back and follow up with us. But, anecdotally, I'd say out of 10 calls, maybe 1 or 2 have been, yeah, this guy was a known bad actor to begin with. He got a hemp license and he was trying to disguise their nefarious activity behind that hemp license. And whether or not law enforcement was able to prove, yes or no, law enforcement is in a predicament too. If they confiscate and then what they confiscate is truly not the other stuff, that puts them at, in jeopardy as well. So they're very, very cautious about, that activity.
How you doing, Randy?
Yes, sir.
What kind of, you talking about the law, the LE aspect of it, what kind of integrations, law enforcement integration do you see I'm a farmer in Central Texas. I ran into DPS a couple of times, which came off, everything was good. But there's still a lack of education with the law enforcement side. What are your suggestions and recommendations for me, like a farmer like myself, to integrate with law enforcement in that certain particular jurisdiction?
I'll tell you what the folks up on the South Plains did. They initially contacted us and said, look, this is what we're going to do. We're a group of 8, 10, however many farmers there were. We'd like to know if you have a contact with DPS that we could visit with here locally so that we can educate them on what we're doing and what we're not doing. And so they did that right off the bat with the folks there on the South Plains, probably in Lubbock. And so they had that one-on-one with them and established a rapport so that, if they're going down the road one day and they've got this load of, whatever, that DPS at least would understand, look, this is what they're doing. They've got the licenses, they've got the permits. And we, as a state, we would have liked to have done that statewide. But we, again, just lack of funding and resources. We did that initially with DPS as we were, in the regulatory rule writing phase. But I think neither agency really had the resources to carry that out to, the masses, if you will. So to you, I would just say, I would recommend that you contact your local law enforcement jurisdictions, both city and county,
Right.
and just let them know, look, this is what I'm doing. And this is my licenses, these are my permits, et cetera. And I think you should be fine.
Okay, but TDA with like a courtesy email, do you suggest the farmer should, like, if we do reach out to law enforcement, do you want a courtesy email to TDAs like, hey, we've contacted our LE, would you like something like that, or is that just too much?
It's really not necessary. And I mean, as long as you do your diligence on your end, and as long as you get your necessary manifests from us, we don't need that. We really don't. I mean, it's just, I think as long as you do your diligence on your end, you'll be fine. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could comment on the Delta 8 and what you think the regulatory standing will be in the future.
We'll get to that.
Oh, perfect.
So
Okay.
before we move on to that part, do you have the recent stats for how many acres, greenhouses, so forth?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that, Lisa, and my apologies.
It doesn't have to be exact. We won't hold you to it.
The thing that I downloaded from our database, I put it on a Word document, and then the numbers got so crunched I couldn't read them, and my printer wasn't working. I'm going to give you some round figures here. In roughly March of 21, we were probably somewhere around 1,200 licensees for producer licenses. Right now today, we're probably sitting at about a little over 1,000 licensees for producer licenses. As far as statistics go on, acres, there's two sets of numbers. There's a number that's reported to us when somebody obtains a lot crop permit. That's a number that, basically they estimate the number of acres they're going to plant or grow. And then there's that which is harvested, which is supposed to be reported to us in the final lot crop report of acres harvested. And so, and then there's a number that was reported by USDA here recently. AMS reported a number that was so whack, nobody understood where that number came from. So I sound like a bureaucrat now. So I really can't off the cuff give you a number right now.
It's okay.
I can pull something up and send it to you and we could, but I would say that probably, I think the number was somewhere around 5,000 acres in the field. And then the number for greenhouse square footage is like in the millions
Wow.
of square feet. All right. And, that it's hard to really extrapolate what that boils down to in the number of plants or greenhouses. And that's one of the things that we probably need to work on to figure out how we get better at reporting those numbers. At the end of this year, we'll feel more confident in the numbers that we report, again, because FSA is now going to start holding people to a more accountability as far as reporting is concerned. And like I said, initially in the first 2 years, they were also trying to figure this out. But now that the final hemp rule has come out, USDA is going to be leaning on our agency to obtain those figures for the purposes of FSA reporting. And so one final thing on that, if you are used to if you're a farmer, you've probably dealt with FSA before in the reporting requirements that you have when you grow a regular traditional crop, corn, wheat, milo, whatever. But if you've never dealt with FSA before, that has been kind of a challenge for them to figure out, all right, what you're growing in a greenhouse in the middle of, College Station, Texas. No, we don't need to hear from you. Well, that's not the case. FSA is going to require that you report that information to them. And now they're going to start enforcing that by requiring us to obtain that information from you before you get a lot crop permit. So moving forward in the future, when you come to us to get a lot crop permit, you're going to have to provide us that FSA information that you obtained when you reported to them what you're doing. So that's
a good nugget of information.
yeah. So
Okay, well, we're gonna have to move on to talking about the product side, testing, processing, all those novel cannabinoids and issues. So the consumable hemp product side is regulated by the Department of State Health Services, which are called DISHs. Mark, can you give us a brief overview of the consumable hemp product regulations?
Okay, I'm gonna run through this real quick, but first I gotta tell you, so there's two completely different pieces. I'm assuming most of y'all are probably familiar with this process, but if you call up Randy and ask him how to turn this into a vape cartridge, he pulls out his garlic and his cross and screams. It kind of looks like the Norwegian painting of the scream. So we've got DSHS has published a series of regulations, which I'm sure most of y'all have seen. Those have not changed a lot. There's been a lot of litigation in the past 2 years, and I'm not going to touch heavily on the litigation. I'll let Lisa give you an overview of that. Basically, the DSHS rules are for how you manufacture and sell consumable hemp products, consumable being the cannabinoids, actually anything you can make from the plant that you could eat, smoke, put on your skin, however you use it. I'm assuming most of you all know that you have to mop your floors, so we won't go into great detail on the specifics in the DSHS, other than I want to touch on a couple of things that we see when we're dealing with clients. We do mostly process troubleshooting for consumable hemp products. We help people that have problems with their formulations. We help people that have problems with LE when they come in and say that's illegal, et cetera. There are a series of requirements in the regulations. I urge all of y'all to read them carefully, but your products must carry a batch number, a batch date, a product name. It has to have what we call a QR code, which unfortunately in the regulation, they call a URL locator, that links to the certificate of analysis. And we're not talking about a generic certificate of analysis. We're talking about the certificate of analysis for that batch. If you do not make your own product, but you have you're white labeling a product, and it has to carry the manufacturer's name, and you have to certify that your product is less than 0.3% Delta-9 THC, and that we brought this up while we were standing outside. That is total Delta-9 THC. So that is Delta-9 THC and THCA. There's a little formula that's given in the regulations for how you calculate that. One of the interesting things in the regs that I want to touch on is what it doesn't tell you. When you're making consumable products in the United States, the governing agency for that is the FDA. The FDA does not, the FDA has decided to punt, okay? They don't recognize cannabinoids as what they call GRAS, which stands for generally recognized as safe. Therefore, technically, cannabinoids cannot be used in an ingestible product, but the FDA is not enforcing this rule in any way, shape, or form. They do, however, still have requirements that if you're making consumables, you have to comply with. If you have synthetic colors, please declare them. If you have artificial flavoring, please declare it. And one that we're intimately involved with right now because it's a pending lawsuit. If you're adding coconut oil, folks, you got to put it on the label, okay? If it is a known allergen, you have to declare that. So when you're making products, when you're buying products for sale, make sure that the labeling is correct.
The
Other-
FDA gives food labeling guidelines that I use and give to my clients for guidance.
Yes.
Where would you recommend people look for that? I mean, I find it on the FDA website.
The FDA website's the best place. The FDA website's actually pretty good. If you go out there, they'll give you the entire list of rules for allergens, for colors, it's called misbranding. If you don't, it's considered to be pretty serious by the FDA. In this particular case, the case we're dealing with, a woman had an allergic reaction to coconut oil that was not declared, and I'll leave it at that. Your imagination is quite good, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, the labeling is key because it could get you in trouble with the FDA, and know that your website, your testimonials, your social media, all of that is an extension of the label.
Plus you get to pay someone like Lisa. Lisa likes to get paid, I'm just telling you.
And the other, I emphasize that because what a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers are doing is they're taking products and having them tested at a lab solely for the purpose of suing the manufacturer. So if it's not quite the exact amount of CBD or THC, or there's something else that's not exactly represented on the label, and they can go after you for that. And some of them are class actions. In some cases, courts are holding across the country that because the FDA hasn't come out with exact regulations for CBD, the courts can't say, well, this label's wrong, because there's not anything yet officially saying what's right or wrong on these products. Are there any other specific requirements people might not be aware of?
Those are the main ones. You do have, if you're a manufacturer, then you are quite aware of some of the requirements, the limitations there. You cannot transfer. So let me back up for a minute. So one of the ways that people deal with hemp, you buy biomass, you go through and you extract out the oils and the cannabinoids, and that is typically called a crude oil. Those crude oils run 2 to 5% Delta-9 THC. sometimes a little hotter. You cannot have a transfer of that material between facilities. So legally, you cannot sell crude oil to someone who wants to use it in their products. What we see is the people that are dealing with this do it all in their own facility. It never leaves the facility. They extract, they make the products, they certify the product as being less than 0.3% Delta-9, and it's legal for sale at that point.
Yeah, that's important. I mean, anything over 0.3 is marijuana, and you can't travel with marijuana.
Yeah, don't
Yes.
drive it around in your car. It's a bad idea.
Hi, Carla Johanning, KJ Scientific. Hi, Mark, Lisa. I have a question for you guys. What do you hear from the FDA? Because I keep hearing, yes, they want to get in this space and botanicals. Obviously, they're very busy with a pandemic, but you know, I keep hearing different things that they're going to get in the space, and others know they're not going to get in the space, but they want more data. What is that you guys hear?
So the FDA has been threatening to get into the nutraceuticals business for 20 years. I hear the same thing you do, and I expect that they'll get in every bit as fast as they've jumped into the nutraceuticals business, maybe a little slower. I do not expect to see FDA jump into this space at all. It is honestly, because of the individual state regulations, it is a nightmare. If FDA were to jump in here, you probably start a civil war. They don't want any part of this.
Can you share with the audience about cannabis testing and regulatory requirements?
Well, and we had touched on this earlier, the measurement uncertainty.
Yes.
Okay, so when USDA wrote the Farm Bill, they turned into the Easter Bunny and laid us a big old Easter egg, okay? They allowed us to adjust our numbers for what is known as measurement uncertainty. Measurement uncertainty is a really hot topic in ISO laboratories, and we live large, you know, I mean, okay. It's an exciting time. What measurement uncertainty basically is a measurement of the statistical variation of your result. So if I tell you that you have, and I'm going to use an example from maybe from an agricultural standpoint here. If I tell you have a hot product, you have 0.35% total Delta-9 THC. By Randy's reading, he says, hey, that's over 0.3, right? But I qualify my number. I tell you that it's 0.35, but I have an error of 0.2%. So I'm telling you that my number is no better than 0.15 to 0.55. It's somewhere in that range, and we called it 0.35. Well, the way the regulation is written, Randy has to take the upper end, so he has to take the limit plus my measurement uncertainty, and that's the upper allowable concentration of Delta-9 in your sample. So in this particular case, if I have a 0.2, then I'm going to be allowed 0.5, okay? 0.35 is less than 0.5%. Your sample is not hot. It's a huge gift. Ideal in a lot of different regulatory environments. No other federal agency does this. Only the USDA.
It's another good nugget of knowledge. So, you know, I think a lot of people are here to learn about these controversial cannabinoids. I know you're involved with the research. And what's the current status of some of these compounds?
Oh. There was a question in the back about Delta. Okay. Let's not stop at Delta 8. Okay. Let's talk about THCs. There are 6 isomers, 6 primary isomers. They're stereoisomers of each one. There's 6 primary isomers of THC. The ones that everybody hears about are Delta-9, now of course Delta-8. There is another one that we know from literature is highly psychotropic, which is called Delta-6A, 10A. There are 3 others. One is Delta-10, which y'all have seen some products on the market, and we can tell you just from analyzing some products, they don't have it. And then there's Delta 6 and Delta 7, and we do not think that you can get to Delta 6 and Delta 7 any way other than synthetically. Most of these products, Delta 8, 6A, 10A, and 10, and then of course, I'm going to give you the flip side of 10 because while you're making 10, you're also making what's called HHC, which is called hexahydrocannabinol. So I don't know how many of y'all have ever looked at a picture of it, but there's two main rings, and the upper ring, depending on where I put the double bond, I change the nomenclature. If I don't have a double bond, that becomes hexahydro. Yes.
After going through the state CSA, they happen to have it listed as Delta 1, 2, 3, 4, and I believe 5 and 6. Why does everybody stay on the current Delta 9, Delta 8 nomenclature? Because quite frankly, if the state's going with it for the regulatory purposes, it doesn't make sense for us as an industry to continue forward with the current.
Okay,
wording.
that's a really good question. And so I'll give you two answers. Number one is the state uses the correct nomenclature. That's called IUPAC nomenclature. And the reason is because if they don't, when they go to court, they run into some smart ass like me who says, that's not Delta 9, it's Delta 1. We should probably use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a whole lot easier. We don't because it's been in the literature as the other stuff for 50 years, 60 years. So it's kind of more just tradition and convenience. Delta 9. Delta 9 is Delta 1, just so you understand what he was saying. We move down around the ring 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what we call Delta 8 would really technically be Delta 6. It's the same, they're the same compounds, and I think most people in the business understand that it's interchangeable. The correct terminology, as he pointed out, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but we're for the purposes of here, we'll keep it at 8, 9, and 6A, 10A. So the way that people are getting to 8, which is the question from the back here, and there's a dozen ways to do this, more than a dozen ways to do this, but everybody's using what's called isomerization. So isomerization means that I have a compound that has a certain molecular weight. CBD and all of the THCs have the same molecular weight. So I start with CBD because I can really get it, and now it's really cheap because y'all are growing a whole lot of this stuff. And going through, and I can tell you, there's an argument here, and Lisa and I'll get into this in a minute about synthetic. Okay. But you can go through either using solvent or solventless processes. You can take the CBD and you can turn it into some of these THCs. Okay. So the two that
When you
you're
say CBD, you're referring to CBD isolate, correct? You're referring to CBD isolate.
Yes, I'm
Yes.
referring to isolate. here.
Roger that.
Okay. I can do it in the plant too. I mean, you can give me the plant and I can put it in a pot and heat it up and I'm going to get the same thing. But it's a whole lot easier if I got a kilo of isolate. Plus I get a whole lot more yield. So the two primary isomers that you get of THC when you go through the first isomerization are Delta 9 and Delta 8. Delta 9, we already know because we all have read our regs and we've all done our homework. We know we can't have more than 0.3% Delta 9 THC. The USDA, in their infinite wisdom, defined hemp. Randy loves me for this one, by the way. USDA defines hemp as follows. The plant species Cannabis sativa L, and any part of that plant, including the seeds thereof, and all derivatives, extracts, cannabinoids, isomers, acids, salts, and salts of isomers, whether growing or not, with a Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol concentration of not more than 0.3% on a dry weight basis. Boys and girls, there's a whole lot of derivatives you can make when you're a chemist, okay? I look at that from my poor little chemistry eyes and say, man, that looks like a whole reagent storeroom. I can go make anything. I can take that. There's a guy out here, booth out here that's got the hemp fiber. I get methanol out of that, okay? Because I can go distill it just like I would distill wood. I'm gonna get methanol. Once I got methanol, I can make acetone. Once I got methanol and acetone, I can make all kinds of things. This is a really cool thing. So the USDA, to answer your question about the Delta 8, USDA didn't tell us anything about Delta 8. They didn't say we couldn't make it. Okay. And the DEA amended the Controlled Substances Act, which we all bow down in gratefulness to them for this, so that when you come into the very top of the CSA up here, the very first thing you get to, right at Schedule 1, says, are you hemp? And if you're hemp, they kick you right out the door. They say, get out of here and go over there to the USDA regulations. Whoo, hey, USDA regulation says I can make Delta 8. I can make 6A, 10A. Man, I make all this stuff legally, as long as I keep the Delta 9 concentration below 0.3%. Okay? Let's talk about Delta 9.
Yes,
Because
the edibles.
Y'all, everybody's been out to the booze. Everybody knows, everybody sees this stuff on the news. Everybody sees this stuff in ads. The new hot thing in the cannabis business right now is Delta 9. Delta 8's so past. I don't know why you bothered to ask me. It's so past. It's so yesterday. The Delta 8. Man, Delta 9. Hey, I want my Delta 9. Well, that was telling a couple of people a few days ago, you know, if you make 100-gram brownie, okay, that's not as big as you would think. It's actually a 4x3 brownie. It's a pretty good sized brownie. It's a lot of brownie. You make 100-gram brownie. Brownie is essentially all dry weight. You baked all the moisture out of this thing. So you're allowed 0.3% of the total weight of that brownie as Delta 9 THC. Right. California limits edible concentrations to 10 milligrams of Delta 9 THC per dose. Okay? So you go to California, buy a gun, you can't put any more than that in there. But I'm not in California, I'm in Texas. And Texas didn't tell me anything about this, and they said 0.3% Delta 9. Well, that's 300 milligrams of Delta 9 in that brownie. Now, I don't know about y'all, but that's way more than anything that I know. Most people can't eat 300 milligrams of Delta 9 without going away for a very long time. And we're only talking about Delta 8 and Delta 9 so far. We haven't talked about 6A, 10A, which we know has effects. We haven't talked about novel, truly novel cannabinoids. And I do want to take a little bit of time and touch on that. You want to, let's ask some questions. Anybody got a question
We're
while
about
we're
out
here?
of time, so how about
Almost
you
about
wrap that
time,
up,
okay.
and then if there's any other
Okay,
questions?
so the one thing I want to touch on the novel cannabinoids. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we didn't really know what these things did. Pharmacologically, we really had no clue what the receptors were good for. Research has come a long way. In the last 5 to 10 years, we've found that the endocannabinoid system is a major pain regulator in the body. So there's a lot of research going on at the moment on how you make a structure, a cannabinoid type structure, that is a true pain. It's called nociceptic. It's a true nociceptic. It will kill pain. And you're starting to see some very weird chemical structures that have 2 tails instead of 1, like THC does. It has a really long tail instead of the short one that THC does. All of this stuff technically is accessible from hemp, and technically, therefore, it falls under the USDA program and would be legal. Would be legal. So even though it's being studied by pharmaceutical companies, technically you could make it in your bathtub if you had the skills to do that. I don't recommend it. Bathtubs get stained.
Well, maybe some questions real quick.
I just had so the 0.2 of your uncertainty there, was that a hypothetical, or that's your actual level of uncertainty?
It varies depending on what we call the matrix. So depending on what the material is, flour, you're going to have a much lower variability than you do in finished products, because finished products typically are filled with oils. So oils mess with the extraction process. They mess with your ability to resolve the cannabinoids. They mess with the whole system. So a 0.2, for example, if you have flour, you would probably expect to see plus or minus about 0.1% in your flour. So you'd probably see a range of like 0.2 to 0.4 for your 0.3. If you have, for example, in our laboratory, if you bring me a Delta 8 concentrate, we know that our variability for Delta 8 concentrate is 0.5. Roughly, it's a little bit less than that. So we could give you a number anywhere between 0 and 0.8, and it's the best we can do for that particular sample type. And it is sample type dependent. It is concentration dependent. It is machine dependent. And the laboratories are supposed to figure all this out and be able to tell you what this is. And one point I'll make on that, if it's not on your report, you need to talk to your lab. It's supposed to be. The USDA very clearly says you must report the MU.
They can't.
Yeah, no, 0.02 is not, okay. So remember what you're measuring. You're measuring the total error in the analytical process, not just the instrument error, right? 0.2 would be the instrumental error, but that doesn't measure in the dilution error. That doesn't measure in, we talked about earlier, what happens when they take a sample, we split it into two. Well, if I grind both those samples, I'll promise you I've got a difference between the concentrations, okay? So you have to measure, the MU is a measurement of the overall error in the analytical process, not just the instrumental error. We've seen laboratories putting that number saying, yeah, 0.0156, 0.01, that's the instrumental error. But they're not taking into account the rest of it, and they're not doing you any favors, right? You want them to report the total error in the analytical process.
This question's for Randy, kind of going back to the agricultural part. You mentioned a lot that there's lack of funding, lack of resources to build out these different departments and build out the program. Where is that funding going to come from to build those departments out within the Department of Agriculture? And what can we do as a community to help push that through?
And it's probably a question for a higher pay grade, but I'm going to take a shot at it. And I mentioned all state agencies in Texas are fee, recovery agencies. In other words, we can only spend what we collect in fees. So if we're going to get any better at that, it's going to have to come from fees being raised, or the legislature is going to have to earmark a certain dollar amount to give us to fund that. So one of those two things is going to have to happen in order for us to come up with a more robust program. I hope that answers your question.
All right, we're about out of time. One more.
Mike's on the way. Do you see the federal government coming in and setting standards and regulations, or do you think it's going to be Texas? And how do you, or what do you recommend the labs do with those incongruencies between their analysis?
Well, in theory, it's already been regulated, right? Because we're all required to be ISO. The problem is that some ISO accreditations are not the same as others. And there are companies out there who will accept really poor laboratory work and tell you, God bless you, my son, you have an ISO certification. California's already taken the step that you're talking about. California has already started the process to publish California-specific analytical methods and require the laboratories to use those analytical methods. I will tell you, having dealt with California environmental, that there is no question at all, it'll be the absolute worst analytical method possibly available, and it will produce the absolute worst data possibly producible. I do not see the federal government stepping into this fight. You have a big issue here in that you have states fighting over tax dollars, right? I mean, it's a revenue generator. Colorado built most of their highways, rebuilt most of their highways with marijuana funding. And I don't really see any agency in the federal government that's in a big hurry to step in the middle of this thing.
It's true.
Well, you would think, right? Somebody's got to want that excise tax, but nobody stepped forward yet to say that they want to have that. It would help things if it was an overarching regulation that covered all of the states. At this point, I think that horse is out the barn. I don't think you could get the states to go back.
That's a good question. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming
I
and
want to
listening
make,
to
I
this.
want to
Oh,
make
go ahead.
one quick comment for y'all, because the fine gentlemen from A&M are speaking this afternoon. I gave you my viewpoint on this as a chemist, okay? Chemistry is kind of like Delta 8, so last year, okay? Plant genetics, ladies and gentlemen, is a huge part of this equation. These folk, man, they grew maroon tomatoes. They look better burnt orange, but they did grow maroon.
Agreed.
He says red. These people can put genes into plants and grow a lot of things, okay? And what the USDA has given them, and I'm for chemists, I'm not speaking for plant geneticists, we'll let them speak for themselves. What they gave them is a template that says, boys and girls, you can grow anything. You can grow anything in that plant as long as it is cannabis to sativa L as your base stock, and you do not exceed 0.3% Delta 9. And hopefully I'll see some of y'all down there at 3:15. We'll hear what the A&M folk have to say, because they're gonna know a whole lot more than I do.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Thank you, Mr. Krause. And I'm sure we'll be around for questions.
Thank you all.
And thank you, Lisa, for moderating this session.